People often ask me what it's like to be a neurosurgeon. They picture me as someone who can simultaneously operate on the brain, think several steps ahead, monitor the patient's vital signs on a monitor, whilst teaching anatomy to students gathered around the operating table, and still hold an intelligent conversation with the anaesthetist, maybe about politics. My wife will probably tell you a different story. She regularly complains that I can only do one thing at a time, and badly. And this really raises a very interesting question. If the human brain is so powerful that it can create symphonies, build spacecrafts, and perform brain surgery, why does it struggle so much to do two simple things at the same time? Today, we're going to explore the fascinating neuroscience of multitasking. We'll discover why true multitasking is mostly a myth, which parts of the brain are involved, and why some people appear better than others at doing several things at once. We will also talk about a fascinating experiment run by one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. And finally, I will go through evidence-based strategies that genuinely work, including, yes, video games. Before I forget, please subscribe to the channel. It helps enormously. Now let's start with an uncomfortable truth. Most neuroscientists believe that true multitasking barely exists. What most people call multitasking is actually something called task switching. The brain rapidly alternates attention between different tasks rather than processing them simultaneously. Think of a spotlight moving rapidly between two actors on a stage. The spotlight moves so quickly that it appears both actors are illuminated at once, but they're not. The same thing happens in the brain. You think you're writing an email while listening to a meeting. In reality, your brain is constantly switching between the two activities. Every switch comes with a small cost. The cost may only be a fraction of a second, but thousands of switches add up remarkably quickly. This is why people who multitask often feel busy without necessarily being productive. We're going to talk about the bottleneck problem. One of my favorite demonstrations comes from Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, famously curious about everything, including his own mind. Feynman wanted to know whether he could perform a mental task while simultaneously estimating the passage of time. Now, Feynman found that he could count perfectly well whilst reading, no problem. But the moment he tried to speak aloud while counting, he lost the count completely. It broke down instantly. He then compared notes with a mathematician friend, John Tukey. Tukey had the exact opposite experience. He could count and speak at the same time without trouble, but he could not count and read simultaneously. Why this difference? Well, it comes down to how each man experienced counting in their head. Feynman was hearing the numbers using what cognitive scientists call the phonological loop, essentially the inner voice. When he tried to speak aloud, he was using that same phonological channel for two things at once. System overload, count lost. Tukey, the mathematician friend, by contrast, was seeing numbers using a visual spatial representation. So speaking, which uses the verbal channel, did not interfere, but reading, which also uses visual spatial processing, did. Now, this is a beautiful real-world demonstration of the bottleneck in action. What Feynman had discovered intuitively was that different tasks compete for limited cognitive resources. Some tasks can coexist peacefully, others fight for access to the same neural machinery, and when they do, performance suffers. Where in the brain does all this happen? The answer is not a single multitasking center. Instead, there are several networks working together. The control systems that underpin multitasking all fall under the umbrella of what neuropsychologists call the executive functions, or EF. Think of EF, the executive function, as your brain's CEO. It plans, prioritizes, monitors, and switches between tasks. The executive function has three core subcomponents. First, inhibition, the ability to suppress irrelevant information or impulses. When you're driving and you're deliberately ignoring a billboard, that's inhibition. That's your executive function at work. The second subcomponent of the executive function is cognitive flexibility, or task switching, the ability to switch mental focus between tasks or rule sets. The third is working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information in mind for short periods of time. Now, all three are essential for effective multitasking. Now, a landmark 2021 meta-analysis published in Developmental Science, a very reputable journal, pulled data from neuroimaging involving nearly 10,000 participants. So it was a very large population study. And they asked, what does the brain look like when it is doing executive function? And the answer was remarkably consistent. A network of regions lit up, regardless of which specific executive function task people were doing. This network, which is called the multiple demand network, includes areas in the front and sides of your cerebral cortex, plus regions in your parietal lobe working in concert. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain right behind your forehead, is absolutely central here. It is the most recently evolved part of the human brain. It is what most distinguishes our cognitive capacity from other primates, and it is the last region to fully mature. Now think about this, the prefrontal parietal network is not fully developed until a person is well into their 20s, which might explain some teenage decision making, but that's for another video. Importantly, this network is not unlimited in capacity. When you demand that it handle two cognitively heavy tasks at the same time, you're asking the same office to run two companies simultaneously. Now, the work gets done, but it's slower and full of errors. Now, let's look at situations where we multitask every day. Let's bring this into everyday life. We all do these things, and the science on each of them is quite sobering. Let's start with driving. This is the most studied dual task situation in the world because the stakes are high and the data is available. Research consistently shows that talking on a mobile phone or even hands-free impairs driving performance to a degree roughly equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.08. That is the legal limit of drink driving in most countries. This is not about where your hands are. It is about where your brain is. The conversation monopolizes the same prefrontal resources you need for hazard detection. Hands-free does not fix this because the problem is cognitive. It's not physical. Let's look at cooking. This is a genuinely complex dual task environment. You are monitoring multiple timers, managing heat levels, reading a recipe, possibly holding a conversation at the same time and performing physical tasks, all simultaneously. Experienced cooks make this look effortless, and to some degree it is for them, because many of these individual components have become automated through practice, many years of practice. But add an unfamiliar recipe or an unexpected problem, and the system can quickly overload. Ask anyone who has burnt a sauce mid-conversation. Now let's look at playing a musical instrument, the piano, for example. A skilled pianist reading a score while playing is simultaneously decoding visual symbols, translating them into motor commands, monitoring auditory output, managing pedaling, and sometimes conducting or communicating with other musicians. Now, this is extraordinary multitasking, but it took years of deliberate practice to automate the lower level components enough to free up cognitive resources for the higher level ones. The music sounds effortless because the brain's effort is largely invisible. Let's look at walking and talking. Now, this one seems trivial until it isn't. Research in older adults shows that when you add a cognitively demanding verbal task to walking, gait speed decreases, balance worsens, and fall risk increases significantly. The clinical term is the dual task cost of walking. In younger people, this cost is small. In those with the Parkinson's disease, for example, or early dementia, or even just older age, it can be dramatic and dangerous. And the reason? Walking, despite feeling automatic, still draws on cognitive resources when the terrain is challenging or the environment is unpredictable. And let's look at surgery. Let me be honest here, the operating theatres is one of the most demanding dual and triple, quadruple task environments humans have designed. The surgeon is managing fine motor skills, visual monitoring of a screen or a field, verbal communication with the team, interpretation of physiological data, and higher order decision making, all simultaneously. We manage this partly through years of training that automates the procedural components, and partly through structured teamwork that distributes cognitive load. But the dual task cost never really disappears entirely. And this is why some operating theatres have strict noise and interruption protocols. Now let's talk about the biggest myths about multitasking. Myth number 1, women are better multitaskers than men. Now this one won't die, and the truth is complicated. Some studies do find small female advantages in certain task switching and attentional measures. But the effect sizes are modest, and the scientific consensus is that this stereotype is heavily overstated. There is no evidence that women have some fundamentally different neural architecture for multitasking. What does exist is a cultural tendency for women to be assigned more simultaneous responsibilities and to practice managing them, which brings us to the more interesting point. Practice matters, and we will get to that. Myth number 2, some people can generally multitask. Now, remarkably, this one is partially true. But the group of true multitaskers is tiny. Psychologist David Strayer at the University of Utah coined the term supertaskers to describe people who show no performance cost whatsoever when performing 2 demanding tasks simultaneously. His research suggests that about 2.5% of the population may qualify. The rest of us, 97.5%, all pay a cost. And here is the cruel irony. Studies consistently show that the people who report multitasking most confidently are often the ones who are worst at it. Number 3, social media multitasking is fine or even beneficial. Now, this has been studied extensively, and the news is not good. People who habitually media multitask, watching TV while scrolling their phone, listening to podcasts while reading, consistently show poorer performance on measures of sustained attention, task switching, and working memory compared to light media multitaskers. A large review found a small but reliable negative association between chronic media multitasking and cognitive control. The habit of spreading attention thinly appears to impair the brain's ability to focus deeply. It is the cognitive equivalent of training yourself to do everything at half effort. Myth number 4, you can learn to multitask by just doing more of it. Not quite. Repetition alone does not build the underlying capacity. It can automate individual components, which reduces their cognitive load, but it does not expand the bottleneck. There is, however, specific training that does work, And this is really where the science gets exciting. And now for the encouraging news. Whilst we may never eliminate multitasking costs, we can reduce them. The brain remains remarkably plastic throughout life. So can we actually improve your multitasking ability? The answer is yes, but the how matters enormously. Now, having reviewed the scientific evidence, the first piece of advice I would give you is this. Practice the two tasks together, not separately. If you're learning a new language, for example, try and have conversations with native speakers from week one rather than waiting until your grammar is flawless. It will feel harder and messier initially. That messiness is the point. A 2014 study found that concurrent dual task training was significantly more effective than training each task alone. Doing them together forces your brain to develop the specific coordination mechanisms, those neural routines for allocating and switching shared resources that transfer to the real situation. Training them apart is like practicing your left hand and your right hand independently, and then being surprised when the piano still needs work. The second piece of advice is to deliberately shift your focus between the two tasks as you practice. Imagine, for example, that you're driving through an unfamiliar city whilst following directions from your sat-nav. For 1 minute, consciously prioritize the driving. Focus on the lane position, the traffic lights, the pedestrians and hazards, while allowing yourself to miss some of the navigation instructions. Then switch priorities. For the next minute, focus more intensely on understanding the upcoming route and road signs, accepting that you're paying slightly less attention to the fine details of vehicle positioning. Finally, try to balance both tasks equally. Now, a fixed approach, always trying to balance both tasks at the same ratio, builds competence at that one ratio, but not much else. So if for example, that ratio is 9:1, 9 being listening to the navigation and 1 paying attention to the traffic lights and the pedestrians, then you build competence in that ratio. But if your attention is needed more towards the pedestrians and the traffic lights, then you haven't developed that skill. Now, the variable approach teaches your brain to manage a shifting resource allocation problem, which is exactly what real life throws at you. My third piece of advice is to exercise in a way that makes you think at the same time. Now, instead of your usual solo run with headphones, you might want to sign up for a beginner's tennis lesson, for example, or a salsa class, or if you're brave, a martial arts session. Now, all of these activities force you to process information, make decisions, and coordinate movement simultaneously. The physical and cognitive load are inseparable. A recent study from last year showed that 24 weeks of structured dual tasking training not only improved performance, but it also protected against the age-related decline seen in the untrained control group over the same period of time. So there's nothing wrong with zoning out on a treadmill. This is a fine exercise. But if you really want to train your brain at the same time, your body and mind need to be challenged together. My fourth piece of advice is to practice mindfulness. This may sound paradoxical after everything we said. The best way to improve multitasking may be to improve single task focus. There is evidence to suggest that mindfulness training strengthens attentional control and reduces susceptibility to distraction. My fifth piece of advice, and this applies to people who might work as surgeons like myself, or whose activity or interest involves fine motor skills together with visual processing. And it's video games. Now, can video games improve multitasking? In 2013, a team at the University of California, San Francisco, led by a neuroscientist, published a remarkable paper in Nature. They built a custom video game called NeuroRacer. In the game, players steer a car along a winding road, and that's the primary task. Periodically, road signs appear and players have to respond to specific signs whilst ignoring others, and that's the secondary task layered on top. Managing them simultaneously is the challenge. Now, in the study, first they measured the group of people aged between 20 and 79, and the finding was stark and linear. Multitasking ability declined steadily with age. Older adults were dramatically worse. A 60-year-old performed worse at this dual task test than a 20-year-old playing it for the very first time. Then they trained a group of older adults, aged between 60 and 85, on an adaptive version of NeuroRacer for just 12 hours for 4 weeks. The game automatically adjusted difficulty to keep players at the edge of their ability. What's sometimes called adaptive training, or the sweet spot just beyond current capacity. The results were striking. Before training, this group showed a multitasking cost of minus 64% compared to doing the driving task alone. After training, that cost dropped to minus 16%. What does it mean? That they went from performing catastrophically worse under dual task conditions to performing nearly as well as when doing the single task. Importantly, their post-training performance surpassed that of an untrained 20-year-old. And when retested 6 months later, with no additional practice, the gains had held. And the improvements were not just on the game, they transferred. The trained group also improved on measures of sustained attention and working memory that had nothing to do with the car game. And this was proven on an EEG, the electroencephalogram, the brain electrical recordings. The EEG recording showed enhanced midline frontal theta power, which is a neural signature of active cognitive control. This means that the training had literally changed the pattern of brain activity associated with executive functions. Now, what does this mean for surgery? A separate line of research published in the Archives of Surgery back in 2007, so almost 20 years ago, studied 33 surgeons at a laparoscopic skills course. Now, surgeons who had played video games for more than 3 hours per week made 37% fewer errors and completed tasks much faster, 27% faster than their non-gaming peers. Current video game skill was one of the strongest predictors of laparoscopic performance, stronger in some analyses than years of surgical experience. Why? Laparoscopic surgery is itself an extraordinary dual task challenge. Now, laparoscopic surgery is keyhole surgery in the abdomen. And you are watching, as a surgeon, you're watching a camera image on a screen while operating instruments inside a body cavity. Your hands move in a different spatial plane to what your eyes see. As a laparoscopic surgeon, you are monitoring the surgical field, communicating with the team, and making the motor decisions all simultaneously. So video games, particularly action games with the fast visual processing, rapid motor responses, and divided attention demands, appear to train precisely those neural circuits that transfer to this environment. And that's very interesting because increasingly surgical simulation platforms are borrowing principles directly from the gaming industry. So to close it up, let me leave you with the things that actually matter. First, stop multitasking when the stakes are high. When a task generally requires your full attention, a difficult conversation, a critical decision, anything where an error has real consequences, give it exactly that. Put the phone down, close the tabs. The bottleneck is real, and pretending it isn't is how mistakes happen. Second, automate the basics. So your brain is free for the hard stuff. Every skill you practice to the point of automaticity, be it a surgical technique, a musical skill, a driving maneuver, is one less thing competing for your limited cognitive resources. The goal of deliberate practice is not just to get better at the task, it is to make it cheaper to run. Third, if you want to do two things well together, train them together. From day one, messily, imperfectly, uncomfortably. That discomfort is the adaptation taking place. Fourth, move your body in a way that also moves your mind. Tennis, dancing, martial arts, team sports, anything that demands simultaneous physical and cognitive engagement. It is the most accessible dual task training available to all of us, and the evidence for its protective effect as we age is compelling. And fifth, if anyone questions why you're playing video games, tell them a neurosurgeon prescribed it. As for my wife, I'm going to start practicing listening while loading the dishwasher, concurrently at the same time, with variable attentional priority. I will report back to you on the results. If you found this useful, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me what is the multitasking situation in your life where you notice the biggest cost, meaning that you find the most difficult. I'm curious. I'll see you next time.